One China's millions me one big ambition in life was to go on the stage. I had nothing much in the way of education, but I could talk, and I loved to act. I was brought up in a Christian home and went to church and Sunday school as a child, but as I grew older I became impatient with anything to do with religion. In those days most girls of the ordinary working class went into service because there were fewer openings for them. So I became a parlour maid, but in the evenings I went to dramatic classes, as I was determined to save and, by hook or by crook, get on the boards. One night, however, for some reason I can never explain, I went to a religious meeting. There, for the first time, I realized that God had a claim on my life, and I accepted Jesus Christ as my Savior. I joined the Young Life campaign, and in one of their magazines I read an article about China that made a terrifying impression on me. To realize that millions of Chinese had never heard of Jesus Christ was to me a staggering thought, and I felt that sorely we ought to do something about it. First I visited my Christian friends and talked to them about it, but no one seemed very concerned. Then I tried my brother. Surely if I helped him he would gladly go off to China. Not me, he said bluntly. That's an old maid's job. Why don't you go yourself? Old maid's job, indeed, I thought angrily. But the thrust had gone home. Why should I try pushing other people off to China? Why didn't I go myself? I began to ask how I could prepare to go to a country thousands of miles away, of which I knew practically nothing except that they needed people to tell them of God's love for them. I was told that I must offer myself to a certain missionary society, and eventually I went to this society's college for 3 months. By the end of that time the committee decided that my qualifications were too slight, my education too limited to warrant my acceptance. The Chinese language, they decided, would be far too difficult for me to learn. I left that committee room in silence, all my plans in ruins. Looking back now, I cannot blame them. I know, if no one else does, how stupid I must have seemed then. The fact that I learned not only to speak, but also to read and write the Chinese language like a native in later years, is to me one of God's great miracles. The committee chairman followed me out. What are you going to do, Miss Aylward? He asked kindly. I don't know, I replied, but I am sure God does not want me to be a parlour maid again. He wants me to do something for him. In the meantime, would you like to help 2 of our retired missionaries who need a housekeeper? Where are they? In Bristol. Will you go? Very well, but first I would like to say thank you for the kindness of everyone here. I'm sorry I haven't been able to learn much at the college, but I have learned to pray, really pray as I never did before, and that is something for which I'll always be grateful. I went to Bristol to look after a Dr. and Mrs. Fisher. I learned many lessons from them. Their implicit faith in God was a revelation to me. Never before had I met anyone who trusted him so utterly, so implicitly and so obediently. They knew God as their friend, not as a being far away, and they lived with him every day. They told me stories of their own lives overseas. God never lets you down. He sends you, GLADYS A, and provides for you. Maybe he doesn't answer your prayers as you want them answered, but he does answer them. Remember, no is as much an answer as yes. How am I to know if he wants me to go to China or to stay in Bristol? I queried. He will show you in his own good time. Keep on watching and praying. The old missionaries helped me and strengthened me, but still I longed to be about my Father's business. Next I went to Neth to work for the Christian Association of Women and Girls. But I did not find enough scope, so I moved to Swansea where I worked as a rescue sister. Each night I went down near the docks and in the dark, unpleasant streets, under the yellow gas lamps, I pleaded with the women and young girls who loitered there. I went into public houses and rescued girls the sailors had made drunk, and took them back to the hostel. And on Sundays I took as many as I could to Snelling's Gospel Mission. I enjoyed this work and felt it was something worthwhile, but still the thought of China tormented me. Always it was China. I could not rid myself of the idea that God wanted me there. I decided that if no missionary society would send me, perhaps I could go out with a family who needed a children's nurse. I went to London to ask advice, but everyone was against such an idea. Put the thought of China out of your head, they insisted. Carry on with the grand rescue work you were doing. I went back to Swansea depressed and dejected, and in the train I pulled out my Bible. I don't really know enough about this to start preaching to other people, I said to myself as I turned over the pages. Maybe I ought to set about really getting to know it. So I started to read at the very first verse, and I read on until I came to Abraham. Now the Lord had said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. General 12, 1-2. That verse pulled me up sharply. Here was a man who had left everything, his home, his people, his security, and gone to a strange place because God told him to. Maybe God was asking me to do Sesame. Next arresting message came when I read the story of Moses. Here again was a man who did something on nothing. What courage he had to set out with a crowd of people who had already shown to themselves decidedly difficult. What faith he must have had to obey God and defy all the might of Egypt and the despotism of Pharaoh. But Moses had to make the move. He had to leave his quiet home in the desert. Here I believe I had come upon a really important message. If I wanted to go to China, God will take me there, but I would have to be willing to move and to give up what little comfort and security I had. Eventually I decided to return to London, get a job as a housemaid, and earn enough money to pay me far to China. In the third day on my new job, I was sitting on my bed reading my Bible. I had now reached Nehemiah. I felt very sorry for him and understood why he wept and mourned when he heard about Jerusalem in its great need and could do nothing about it. He was a sort of butler and had to obey his employer just like I did, I thought. Then I turned to the second chapter. But he did go, I exclaimed aloud, and got up, a strange elation within me. He went in spite of everything. As if someone was in the room, a voice said clearly, Gladys A. word, is Nehemiah's God your God? Yes, of course. I replied. Then do what Nehemiah did, and go. But I am not Nehemiah. No, but assuredly I am his God. That settled everything for me. I believed these were my marching orders. I put my Bible on the bed, beside it my copy of Daily Light, and, at the side of that, all the money I had, 2/2d. What a ridiculous little collection it seemed, but I said simply, Oh God, here's the Bible about which I long to tell others, here's my daily light that every day will give me a new promise, and here is 2/2d. If you want me, I am going to China with these. At that moment, Another maid put her head in at the door. "Are you clean crazy, Gladys, gabbling away to yourself like that?" But I did not care. I felt that God was making me move, and I was ready to obey. The bell rang. Me mistress wanted me. I always pay the fares of my maids when I engage them. "How much did you pay getting here?" "It was 2 shillings and 9 pence from Edmonton, madam." "Then take this 3 shillings, and I hope you'll be happy here, Gladys." "Thank you, madam." So, in a few moments, my 2.50 had increased by 3 shillings. I worked on my days off in other houses as parlour maid, sometimes earning 10 shillings or £1 for helping at a dinner. Sometimes I worked through the night at a society party and earned up to £2.10. Asterisk saved it all. I went to the shipping offices and inquired about the fare to China. £90 seemed to be the lowest until a clerk said, "If you want the cheapest, of course, it is the railway overland through Europe, Russia and Siberia." I went to Muller's in the Haymarket. "How much will it cost for a single ticket to China?" I asked. The booking clerk's eyes almost popped out. "China. China, did you say? Now, come on, miss, we haven't time for jokes. What do you want?" "I want to know how much it will cost for a single ticket on the railway to China." "Well, I never." "All right, I'll find out for you if you will call again in a day or 2. The ticket was to cost £47.10 from London to Tientsin, but I was strongly advised not to try it, for there was fighting in Manchuria and there was no guarantee that I would ever get through. "It's far too much of a risk," the clerk insisted. "I am the one who is taking the risk. Will you let me save for that ticket?" I put £3 down, and every time I saved £1 I took it to Muller's. At first, saving the fare had seemed almost an impossibility, but in the next few months strange things began to happen. One day my mistress was going to a garden party with one of her society friends, but at the last moment the friend was ill and could not attend. My mistress sent for me and calmly announced, "Gladys, I want you to accompany me instead of my friend." "But I can't go to a smart garden party." "Why not?" "Have you seen my best clothes?" "Oh, if that is all, here is the key of my wardrobe. Help yourself to everything you need." I was feminine enough to enjoy myself thoroughly that afternoon. Dressed from top to toe in clothes far better than anything I had ever worn before, I trotted around with my mistress, feeling quite at home. When we returned, I was about to take off my borrowed finery, but my mistress said, "You look very nice this afternoon. I want you to keep everything you have on." So here I was, provided with clothes such as I could never have afforded myself, and I wore them till I went to China. Thus in the autumn, because of many, almost miraculous little happenings like this one, instead of taking 3 years to save the fare, I had already paid the whole £47.10. At Muller single quote s. Now the question was, where in China was I to go? It was about this time that a pastor called at my mother's house and enlisted my help in a campaign at his church. This was the first time I had ever done any real public work. It was at one of these meetings that an old lady stopped me and said, "I am interested in China too, because a friend of mine has a friend who has just gone back to that country. Her name is Mrs. Lawson. She is 73 and has been a missionary in China for years. She came home after her husband died, but could not settle, so she's gone out again in spite of her age. Now she has written to my friend saying that she is praying earnestly that God will lay it on the heart of some young person to go out to China and carry on the work that she can only begin to do. That's meant for me, all right, I said, and immediately I set about seeking the friend who had the letter. I wrote to Mrs. Lawson, and after a long wait the reply came. I will meet you at Tientsin if you can find your way out. That settled it for me. The railway was to take me to Tientsin. Mrs. Lawson was to meet me there. Then hasty packing began. My father insisted that I go home for a few days, and all of them did their best for me. Ivy Benson, a friend who also was a maid, gave me a badly needed suitcase, though it wasn't until long after that I discovered the anonymous gift came from her. My mother sewed secret pockets into me coat and an old corselet for my tickets, passport, Bible, fountain pen, and 2 travelers' checks worth £1 each. Another friend gave me an old fur coat and, between them, the family fitted me out with warm clothes. How good they were to me, I realize more fully now as I look back. How great was the sacrifice my parents were making in allowing their daughter to go off alone to a place thousands of miles away, knowing full well that in all probability they would never see her again. How much I have to thank them for that they did not try to hold me back. In my suitcase I had crackers, cookies, tins of corned beef, baked beans, fish, meat cubes, coffee essence, tea, and hard-boiled eggs. In an old army blanket I carried my other odds and ends, such as a few clothes, a bedroll, a tea kettle, a saucepan, and a small spirit stove which completed my equipment. I had no money to buy food on the way, so I intended to live on what I had with me. The suitcase was heavy, but at least it would grow lighter the farther I went. Asterisk 2.5 pence, about 2.5 cents the United States. Asterisk about $7.50. 2 moving Audi set off from Liverpool Street Station at 9:30 a.m. on Saturday, October 15, 1932. As the train drew out and I caught the last glimpse of my loved ones, I felt very small and insignificant. Like Abraham and Moses, I had left all behind me and was moving out into a place unknown with only God to help me. The journey began well, and I spent a good deal of my time writing a sort of diary-like letter home. We crossed from Harwich to Flushing, then began the train journey through Holland. When I had stood on Liverpool Street Station with my family, I had especially noticed one couple who were boarding the train, probably because the gentleman had a small goatee. I did not see them again until I entered a carriage at Flushing, when I found myself seated opposite them. The lady smiled at me. "You were the little girl who had such a crowd seeing you off at Liverpool Street, aren't you, my dear?" "Yes, those were my parents and friends." "And where are you going?" "I am going to China." "To China? Oh, I suppose you have a young man there, and are going to be married." "No, I have not got a young man. I am going to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ." Both of them stared at me more closely, but at that moment an attendant appeared at the door. Felady spoke in French, and a few moments later the attendant reappeared, carrying a tray containing 3 cups, a jug of chocolate and a plate of cookies. "Now you must join us, my dear," the lady said firmly, and I was glad to do so. "We have just been to the Keswick Convention," she went on. "Now we are returning to The Hague, where we have our home. I am English, but my husband is in the Dutch Parliament. We have had a wonderful week of blessing and are going back much refreshed spiritually. My heart beat with joy. Here were two more people who loved my Lord. We talked quietly together, and after a time the lady said, "My dear, I am going to make a pact with you. For as long as I live, every night at 9 o'clock I am going to pray for you. I want you to write your name in my Bible, and let me write mine in yours. If we never meet again on earth, someday we will meet above." When they got out at The Hague, the lady kissed me with real affection, and there were tears in her eyes. We had only met for so short a time, yet we had felt strangely drawn to each other. The gentleman stood at the window and held my hand as he said reverently, "God bless you very richly, my dear, and keep you ever near to him." As the train drew away, I looked after them for as long as I could. They seemed to be the last link with the home and people I had known. It was only when I sat down again that I became conscious that he was holding something in my hand. I looked down and found I was holding an English pound note. Strange to give me that, I thought. He knows I am going where English money is no good. I hid it, however, in one of my special hiding places, and, thousands of miles farther on, that pound note helped me out of a very difficult place. I might almost say it saved my life. Now, indeed, I felt truly alone. All around me were people wearing different clothes and speaking amicably of languages I could not understand. When we entered Germany, a railway official tried to ask me questions. I could not understand a word he said. Eventually a German girl came to my rescue. She could speak a little English, and she explained that this man wanted to know if I had anything to declare at customs. The German girl was very kind and took me to her home to stay the one night I was forced to spend in Berlin. And the next day she showed me around the city before I set off from a long journey via Warsaw, Moscow and Lake Baikal to Harbin. Of course, there was much that went on around me in the stations that I could not understand, but Russia depressed me terribly. The people were poor and dirty, and the women seemed to do much of thorough work, even carrying heavy loads. Always there were crowds of people waiting in the stations, surrounded by bundles which seemed to contain all their household goods. The Russians looked haggard and unhappy. Even the children were cold, for I saw quite small boys and girls staggering along under heavy loads. As I sat in the great Moscow station, I saw dozens of soldiers, but how different from ours. They were dirty and untidy, and carried bread under their arms. As they walked about they broke off lumps and chewed them. I was, by this time, feeling very much alone, a small, strange woman in a very foreign land. But in spite of this, there was a great peace in my heart as I looked back on all God had done for me so far. He truly believed He intended me to get to China to work for Him there. The days of travel were sometimes monotonous, for I could not speak to anyone, but so far I had suffered no actual discomfort. I was managing very well on my rations, and sometimes at night I was able to rent a bed, a feather mattress from which feathers floated all over the place when I enrolled it. Our only exercise was to walk along the corridor, except when the train stopped to take on a supply of wood for the engine. Then we all got out and walked about while the train staff sawed up the wood. As we traveled farther across Russia, water became very scarce. My small tuk-tuk had to last all day. The country became wilder and the train jolted badly at times. I found that I lost my appetite and did not feel so well, but this I put down to lack of proper exercise. On Saturday, October 22, my 7th day since leaving home, we crossed the border into Siberia. I had to change trains, and now we were in a snow-covered land. I did not think it was possible that there could be so much snow in the world. The sun shone brilliantly, and I sat and marveled at the beauty and wonder of this country with its tall trees, great mountains and wide flat steppes. Yet, I still had to say, poor Russia. It was very, very cold at night, and it was hard to keep even slightly warm. On Monday, the 24th, a man who could speak a little English entered my compartment. We managed to carry on a rather difficult conversation, but it was good to have someone to talk to. We asked each other many questions and, through him, the conductor was able to tell me that the trains were not running to Harbin, so I would probably be held up at the border. This, of course, gave me a very anxious night. What would I do if I was stranded here, thousands of miles from anyone who could help me? Then I thought, I am failing my God. He isn't thousands of miles away. He is right beside me. Why should I worry about my journey when God is helping me all the time? Even if I could have done so, I would not have turned back, for I believed God was going to reveal himself in a wonderful way. The train by now was packed with soldiers going to the frontier, but, on the whole, I was treated very well. I had known before I set out that Russia and Japan were at war and that the railway service in Manchuria would probably be affected. The soldiers confirmed my fears. They told me I could not reach Harbin, the junction where I had to change to the Manchurian Railway, because a train had been captured by the Japanese and the line was blocked. Later a Russian railway official came to the door of my carriage and spoke to me, but, of course, it could not make head or tail of what he said. He gesticulated, pointed and shouted, but it was no use, so finally he shrugged his shoulders and departed. The train went on all that day, but during the evening it stopped again. All the soldiers tumbled out, but, having no idea what was happening, I sat still in my corner. After an hour or so, I walked along the corridor and found the train absolutely deserted. The lights were out, even on the station. Suddenly the sound of gunfire startled me, and I realized that I had come to the fighting line and that train would go no further. Hurriedly I stuffed my belongings into my suitcase and old blanket and, carrying these, together with my little stove, tea kettle and handbag, I climbed onto the platform. I had to move carefully because my tea kettle had some water in it, and this was far too precious to spill. It was bitterly cold. The wind howled around me, bringing with it fine, powdered snow. I sat on my luggage, miserable, cold and hungry, somewhere near the Manchurian border with not a soul in sight. I thought I would freeze to death, and for the first time real doubts came to my mind. Oh God, is it worth it? I cried. Like a flash came the answer, be not afraid, remember I am the Lord. So I prayed that God would show me what to do and deliver me, and He did. I decided that I could sit still in the open no longer, so I stumbled around the deserted station until I found a small hut. Inside I was surprised to find 4 men, the guard, the engine driver, the fireman and the station porter. They recognized me because they had tried to make me leave the train at Chita. Once more a pantomime of gesticulation began. They pointed up the line and made popping noises like guns. They pointed to the train and shook their heads to show it would not be moving. At length I gathered that it would wait to take the wounded back, but they had no idea when that would be. Then they pointed down the line and showed me that I would have to walk back. They imitated me carrying my bundles and me took a till and they laughed, so I laughed too. though actually there was little about my present situation to look at. Eventually they made me a cup of strong coffee which I drank gratefully, and bade me farewell. I teed me bed all across my shoulders, gathered up my bundles in the precious tea kettle and set out to walk along the railroad track back to Cheetah. I was forced to keep to the track because of the deep snow, but even then it was hard going. On each side towered great forests of pines, their branches creaking under their heavy load of snow. About midnight I was exhausted, so I pulled myself and my luggage off the track, ate a few stale crackers, boiled water for my coffee essence, then lay down on top of my suitcase, with my old fur coat wrapped around me. I heard a great deal of barking and howling not far off, and wondered why anyone had let so many dogs out at that time of night. Never for a moment did it occur to me that the noise was made by packs of hungry wolves. This was one time when my ignorance proved a blessing in disguise. I did not stay there long, for it was too cold. Long before dawn I set off again, and trudged along the entire day, only stopping for short rests, until at last, late in the evening, I saw the flickering lights of Cheetah far down the line. With a last desperate effort I dragged myself and my belongings onto the platform and sank down wearily on top of them. People came to look at me and, indeed, I must have looked a sorry sight. I was dirty, untidy and very tired. I sat for hours getting colder and stiffer, but no one seemed to bother. Just as I was deciding that the best thing I could do was to make some kind of a commotion so that they would arrest me and take me somewhere out of the awful cold, a soldier arrived to make me move again. But I just sat there unmoved. Then 3 more came and, at last, an official in a red hat appeared. Seeing that I would not move without my luggage, they picked it up and marched me off to a place so filthy that I cannot describe it. The stench was so bad that I almost fainted. I showed them my passport, and said, "British." So they railed me off from the other people, but all around me were men and women in a horrible condition of filth. I felt ill and almost petrified with fear at misery I saw everywhere. I thought this was the end of me, and I could eat nothing. Many of my secret pockets had been searched and almost everything of value was taken from me, as well as my luggage. Only my little pocket Bible was left. I took it out and held it up to the dusty little light to try to read it, but the light was too dim. However, as I held it up, out dropped a piece of paper, a leaf torn from a daily calendar. And because the print was large and black, I could read, "Be ye not afraid of them, I am your God." A verse from Nehemiah. How that page got there, I don't know, but after all these years I still have it. To me it was a special message sent to me from God in my direst need. That was my promise. My God would be with me whatever happened. These people could not harm me unless God allowed it. For some hours I must have been half unconscious until a man grabbed me and marched me out and along a corridor. We passed a Russian soldier who was just having a drink. He pushed the mug into my hand, and I gulped down the cold tea, which revived me and made me realize that I was faint with hunger. I was taken before an official to be questioned. Another man who was supposed to be able to speak English was brought in, but I had great difficulty in understanding him. Nothing was done for me that day, and I was left under guard, so all I could do was lie down and go to sleep. All the next day they kept questioning me. My passport had been stamped showing that I had left Cheetah, so why had I come back again? Of course, I found it almost impossible to explain. Also, it seemed that they thought I had something to do with Missionary. They told me they needed people like me, and tried to persuade me to stay and work in Russia. This terrified me and I prayed desperately for help. Among my belongings they had found a photograph of my brother in the dress uniform of the army band, and this seemed to have impressed them very much. Evidently they thought I was of some importance. Eventually I pulled out my Bible and showed them a little picture text I had in it. They seemed to understand, for they gave me a new visa and another ticket for the next part of my journey. On Friday I was taken around the town of GLADYS, evidently with the idea of showing me what a fine a place it was. Then I was given my luggage and put into the train with instructions to get out at Nikolshisha Junction, get another train from there to GLADYS, and thence to Harbin. It was the best he could do for me, and I was grateful to them for their efforts to help me. When I reached GLADYS, there was no train to take me further. The Japanese had closed in, and there was no way through. As I sat in that station, cold, miserable and frightened, I saw a sight which I have never forgotten. About 50 people, men, women, even young girls, were chained together by hands and feet and were being driven along by guards. Many of them were in tears, the girls almost hysterical. They were being taken to Siberia to work in forced labor camps. From that moment I hated communism with all my being. I had to spend all that night on the station. In the morning I saw a train coming the other way going back to GLADYS, and looking out was a face obviously not Russian. In desperation I cried, "Can you tell me how to get to Harbin?" "Wonder of wonders," he replied in English. "You can't, it's blocked. Go to Vladivostok." 3 From the net of the foul next train was so crammed full that I could not get on, but I managed to push my way on to the next stone after that, and sank down hoping that eventually I would arrive in Vladivostok. When, at length, I found myself in the Vladivostok station, I had no idea what to do, or where to go. I sat down and prayed. Into my mind came an advertisement I had often seen. "See Russia through in tourist." I got up and went to first one and then another saying, "In tourist." Most of them looked as if thought I was mad, but at last, a man who said he was an interpreter took me to an office, and from there to an hotel. The interpreter took my passport, saying it would have to be stamped. He seemed pleasant and kind at first, and it was a great joy to be able to have a real wash, to change my clothes and to sleep in a proper bed. My interpreter offered to show me the town, but the sordid squalor appalled me. Long lines of people stood waiting for black bread. There was no pavement, and the streets had great holes in them. The people were very like the Japanese, dark-skinned with tiny eyes. The women were shockingly thin, scantily clad, and usually had heavy babies tied on their backs, as well as great bundles on their shoulders. After some days I began to feel desperate. I asked the interpreter for my passport, but he tried to put me off. "Why do you want to leave?" he asked. "You have no money to buy tickets. You cannot get to China. Stay here and help us." "Why do you want to keep me?" I asked. "Why do you follow me about and watch my bedroom?" "We need people like you in this country, our new country, new civilization, a land free from the fetters of capitalism." "No, I will not stay," I replied quickly. "I have seen all I want to, thank you, all the dirt, the squalor, the bad roads, the thin, underfed women, the awful poverty. But we will alter all that. That is why we need people like you, men and women who know how to handle machines, who can work in factories and train our people." "But I am a missionary. I am going to China," I know nothing of machines. He looked at me so strangely that a cold chill ran over me. China is far away. You stay in Russia, we will look after you. This conversation alarmed me, but what could I do? Without my passport, it was impossible for me to move. Utterly miserable, I felt I must get away by myself for a while. I left the hotel to walk to the seashore. As I went out, a girl came from behind the door and whispered urgently, "I must speak with you at once. I have waited until the interested man left you. Walk along, I want to talk." We walked for a short distance. When no one was near, I said, "Who are you and what do you want?" "That does not matter," she replied in clear but guttural English. "You want to leave this place? Well, if you don't get out now, you will never get away." "But what can I do?" "You must do just what I say. The authorities have no intention of letting you go. Get your things together, and be ready. When an old man knocks at your door, be ready to follow him. Do not ask questions, just follow him." The girl left and I went back to my room. What was I to do? How did I know that this was not a trap? Whom could I trust? I was lying on the bed, my head throbbing with anxiety, when there was a knock at the door. I opened it, and there stood the man who had taken my passport. He held it in his hands but did not offer it to me. Suddenly I grabbed it from him and threw it behind me into the room, at the same time saying far more boldly than I felt, "You are not coming in here." "Why not?" "Because this is my bedroom. I am the master, I can do with you what I wish." "Oh, no, you cannot. You may not believe in God, but He is here. Touch me and see. Between you and me God has put a barrier. Go." He stared at me, then shivered and, without another word, turned and left me. I sat down on the bed, shaking all over. After such an encounter I had to get away. When I had calmed down a little, I picked up my precious passport and stared aghast at what I saw. GLADYS A word, British subject, profession, machinist. They had altered the word, missionary. Now I knew that I had to do as the girl said. She had been right about them wanting to keep me. Hurriedly I bundled what was left of my belongings together, and knelt down to pray during the time of waiting. In the early hours of the morning there was a gentle tap on the door. I opened it a crack and saw an old man standing there. He said nothing but held out his hand for my suitcase, while I took the bundle and the tea kettle. Then we trailed up and down what seemed to me to be miles of streets, stumbling over the uneven cobbles, and at last came to the docks. We sat down in a dirty little shack until it was light, then he left. I sat alone wondering what was going to happen next. Suddenly I found the girl who had spoken to me the previous day, standing beside me. "Have you anything of value?" she asked. "Nothing. Everything of value has been taken from me." "Have you any money?" "No." "Then all you can do is to go into that hut and throw yourself from the mercy of the captain. Plead with him, beg him to take you. You must get on that boat at all costs." "Why have you helped me like this?" "You need helping." "What can I give you?" "I have no money." "Have you any clothes?" "Only what I am wearing." "But take these gloves. They are old but they are warm, and these darned stockings. Please take them." She took them and disappeared. I went up to the wooden hut and slowly pushed open the door. A Japanese captain was sitting there alone. "Are you the captain of that boat, sir?" I asked, hardly daring to hope he would understand English. "I must get on it, I must get on it." "Speak slowly, please." "Good morning. What can I do for you?" "I want you to take me to Japan, but I have no money." "You have no money. Have you valuables?" "No, nothing at all." "Are you British?" "Yes, sir. Here is my passport. Please take me with you." Slowly he examined my passport, then nodded his head. "I see you are in trouble. That will not do. Will you put yourself under my protection and become my prisoner?" I felt I would far rather be with the Japanese than the Russians, so I willingly agreed. "You must sign these papers, then you will be safe," he said. "We leave at once." Just as I was going up the gangway, some Russian soldiers seized me and pulled me back. They sailors stood on the ship, looking down, but they could give me no assistance because they dared not cause trouble. Desperately I threw my suitcase and bundle onto the deck of the ship and, on an inspiration, pulled out the English pound note the member of the Dutch Parliament had given me at The Hague. "Look, I buy myself off," I cried. The soldiers stared at the note and relaxed their hold. I leapt onto the boat, which was just beginning to move, and left part of my coat in the hand of the soldier who had grabbed me. But, at least, he was now under Japanese protection. That Japanese captain was a true gentleman. He was clean and polite and treated me well. Some time later, when I had calmed down after my ordeal and had managed to tidy myself up a little, I noticed a woman huddled in a corner, looking desperately ill and miserable. "Are you feeling ill?" I asked. She replied in English, "Yes, very ill." "Is it because you have been seasick?" "Oh, no, nothing like that. It is because of what has happened. Look at my hands." Removing a piece of rag, she held out her hands, the fingers of which were torn and bleeding. "That's where they tore my rings from me." "Who did that?" "The Russians. They have stripped us of everything we possessed. My husband is a tea planter. We have been home on furlough and we're returning to Shanghai. Every bit of our luggage and money has been taken. We are lucky to be alive." We talked for a little while, but I did not see this woman, whom I think was a German, again, because I had to stay on a different part of the ship. Eventually the boat reached Japan, and here I found I was the first off because, being a prisoner, he was handed over to the British consulate. A young man arrived to get me and told me I was the biggest fool he had ever met. Even to think of setting out on such a journey was crazy. He bought me a good meal, however, and a ticket to Kobe. I knew I would find help at Kobe, and when I arrived I made my way to the mission hall in a rickshaw. This was my first experience of such a strange mode of transportation. When I reached the house, I was bowed to, and my shoes removed. This was very embarrassing, for he had a hole in my stocking. A lady called Miss Auntie took me to her home, and how good it was to be in an ordinary, civilized house again. I had a boiling bath in a large wooden tub, then went to bed in a pretty room with a white bed with a blue cover on it, and lighted by a lantern with a red and blue shade. The next day, Saturday, November 5, I left Kobe after having my ticket exchanged for one Totensen. My friends from the mission escorted me to the steamer and explained about me to the captain, so again I was well looked after. I found the food strange and hard to digest. Each person had a little tray with many tiny pots containing soup, meat mixture, salad and vegetables, rice and tea. The other passengers seemed to enjoy mixing all the food together, but I found the rice very hard to swallow. There were no chairs to sit on, and, after removing our shoes, as is customary, we all sat cross-legged on straw mats on the deck. I found this made me very tired and my back ached. We passed through beautiful country. High mountains in the distance were covered with snow. Left nearer hills were light with bright green and glorious red trees. The houses were quaint and decorative, for their gables and gates were hung with flags and banners. I was beginning to feel very dowdy and grubby, especially among the Japanese women who were so clean and wore beautiful kimonos. On Tuesday, November 8, the captain sent for me toward evening and told me that over there was China. Away on the horizon, across a muddy, yellow sea, I saw China at last. 2 days later I actually set foot in China, at Tientsin, and immediately made my way to the missionary headquarters. It was bitterly cold, but I was made very welcome, and we all joined together in thanksgiving. I sang, "Praise, my soul, the King of Heaven," with a very full heart. I had expected to meet Mrs. Lawson at Tientsin, but she was many miles away in the mountains. She had sent an escort called Mr. Liu for me, however, so on Saturday we traveled by train to Peking. The trains were very uncomfortable, for each compartment held about 40 or 50 people, who were just laid about by the lurching train. We stayed overnight in Peking at a Chinese inn, but the dirt and discomfort were appalling. The next morning we left Yangtze by bus as the railroad ended at Yangtze, which is the border of Shanxi province. The bus rocked from side to side, and I was amazed that a bus could travel on such roads, up and down mountains, through brooks and rivers. Nothing seemed to trouble the drivers. The first night we stopped at Sinchao, and the following one at Tishao, where there was a mission station. From here it was 2 days' journey by mule to Yongchen, where I was told Mrs. Lawson was living. We crossed 3 mountain ranges and forded numerous rivers, and I will never forget that first journey with a mule later. I thought I would be broken in little pieces before we reached Yancheng, and every bone in my body ached and protested. When, at last, Mr. Liu stopped the mules before a gateway, and said, "This is Yancheng," I fell off me animal's back and tottered painfully forward. Mrs. Lawson came to the gateway, and I bowed, feeling very humble and insignificant. I knew I was dirty, untidy and wilting with fatigue. How would this woman, who had toiled in China for so many years, regard the raw, ignorant recruit who had come to join her? Actually, I believe she was very pleased to see me, but Jeannie Lawson was Scottish and never showed emotion, so her first greeting was certainly not effusive. As I bowed she said, "And who are you?" "I am GLADYS A, who wrote to you from London." "Oh, yes. Well, are you coming in?" I had an irresistible desire to laugh, but I managed to turn it into a cough. I had come thousands of miles to join her, and here she was asking me, "Are you coming in?" in just the same tone of voice as me mother's next-door neighbor might have used if I had gone to return a recipe or something I had borrowed. However, I went inside and took a quick glance at what, I hoped, was to be my future home. It was scarcely attractive. The gateway led into a huge courtyard from which doors into various rooms opened on all sides, but the whole place was littered with fallen masonry, pieces of paper and other rubbish. "I suppose you will be hungry," Mrs. Lawson remarked and disappeared into the kitchen. A few moments later she returned with a bowl of some queer concoction. I looked at it, I smelled it, and only good manners stopped me from turning away in disgust. Gingerly I tasted it, and thought it was horrible, but it was either that or nothing, and I was very hungry. So, with a great effort, I managed to eat half the bowlful. We talked for some time, and Mrs. Lawson explained that the house was very old and in a poor part of the town, but that she had come to live here because it was empty and it was cheap. The rent was $2.4 a year. No Chinese would live in it because they believed it was haunted by devils. Mrs. Lawson remarked calmly that she had driven them away. At least, she had never seen any since she had lived there. She was trying to get the place cleaned up, but she could not do much at a time. She did not suggest taking me to my room. After some time, I asked timidly if I might go to bed as I was very tired after the journey. "Oh, yes, of course, you do just what you wish," Mrs. Lawson replied. "But where do I sleep?" "Oh, anywhere," she said, waving her arm around vaguely. "Anywhere you like." So I chose one of the rooms, swept the litter on the floor to one side, and put down my bedroll. Then he looked around. There were no curtains, no glass in the windows, and no door in the doorway. He approached Mrs. Lawson again. "Where do I undress?" "Why do you want to undress?" "Because I want to go to bed." "Oh, I wouldn't bother to undress. It is so much safer to keep all your things on in bed, then they cannot be stolen. As you see, we have no doors to lock." So I got into bed with my clothes on, and all my things gathered around me, and for the first time and to sleep in the place that was to be my home for many years. In the morning when I awoke I was very glad I had followed Mrs. Lawson's advice, for every window was crowded with curious yellow faces. Evidently word had gone around the town that a foreigner had arrived, and they had come to inspect the strange sight. It would certainly have been very embarrassing if I had had to dress before so many spectators. About 30 cents. For among them all Yancheng itself was beautiful, a little Chinese town set in a valley between high, bare mountains. It had a wall all around, many narrow winding streets, and numerous temples which must have been hundreds of years old. It was on the ancient mule track from Hope to Honan. There were no real roads in that part of China, only the muddy, uneven mule tracks, and every day long mule trains passed through, or at night stopped in the inns. There were few trees in Yancheng, and the mountains were brown and bare, but there was great beauty nevertheless. In winter there was deep snow and it was very cold. It was nearing the end of November when I arrived at Yancheng, 5.5 weeks after setting out from Liverpool Street Station. But how much I had seen! How much I had learned in those weeks! And above all, for how much I had to worship my God. Mrs. Lawson had a little money of her own, but I had nothing, and we had to exist somehow. Soon after my arrival Mrs. Lawson explained her purpose in living in such a place. "You see, Gladys, I intend to turn this place into an inn." "But how, and who will come?" I asked. "The muleteers will come as they do to other inns in the town. You know what Chinese inns are like?" I agreed with feeling. I would never forget those in which I had stayed on the way to Yangqing. All the muleteers require is a night's lodging, a place on the kang, the long brick bed that is built down one side of the dormitory, an evening meal of millet and flour strips, and some fodder for their beasts. We can hire a Chinese cook for a few pence a week. Then when the men have had food and are resting in the courtyard, we can talk to them. That will be the beginning." But how will we get them to come here? You have seen a Chinese landlord standing outside his inn smiling a fat welcome? Then, as the first mule in the mule train passes him, he grabs the animal's head and drags it into the courtyard and, of course, the rest of the beasts follow. Once he has got them inside, he tells the muleteers what a good infant is, and the muleteers are usually too tired to argue. That will be your job. My job? To grab a mule's head and drag him inside? Yes. You will bring them in, then I will talk to them. But do mules bite? Not if you grab the right part. So we started to get the inn cleaned up and ready for our customers. We got an old man who could cook after our fashion, and then I stood outside, shaking with fright. The cook had taught me what to say. As I saw the first mule approaching, I yelled loudly, "Mayu bicha, mayu gutsu, how, lay. That simply meant, we have no bugs. We have no fleas. Good. Come. I felt something like a man at the circus shouting, "Come one, come all, come to the fair." The first mule I pulled in was fortunately old and docile, but its owner was so frightened that he ran away, though he returned later when he found that his companions had come to no harm. Soon our inn became known from Hopetahonan. Muleteers were the newsmen of North China, and they made it known that the inn of the foreign ladies was clean, the food was good, and at night they had long stories told free of charge. At first Mrs. Lawson or Mr. Liu told the Bible stories while I listened. I was trying very hard to learn the language, but for the time being the most useful job I could do was to look after the mules, to feed them and scrape the filthy mud off them, so that their owners could sit at ease listening to the stories. Besides the work in the inn, we went out to the villages. On Sundays we got up early and, as soon as the city gates were opened, we went to a strange village. Crowds of people would rush out to stare at us, for they had never seen a white person before. Then we would choose an open space and Mrs. Lawson would start to speak. Everyone would stop what they were doing and stand outside their homes. Then after a while Mrs. Lawson would let them ask questions. "Why have you come?" they would ask. "Where do you come from? How old are you? Is she your daughter?" And so on. Then they would feel our clothes, lift up our skirts to see what we had underneath, and talk excitedly about our feet. Every Chinese woman had bound feet at that time, and our feet always caused much interest. For several months I struggled with the language. I gave out tracts. I sang to the people, and at night I scraped mud off the mules and helped to look after the rough and none too sweet-smelling owners. This was not at all the sort of life I had pictured for myself when I had been in England, but it was a splendid battle course for what was to follow. Mrs. Lawson was, at times, far from well, and I wondered what would happen if she were to die. Never were two people more unlike thrown together in a strange land. Jeannie Lawson was old, dour and dogmatic, while I was young, full of enthusiasm, and also had a strong mind of my own. There was only one thing we had in common, and that was the firm belief that God had sent us to this place and had some especial work for us to do. How I longed to be able to speak to these people as Mrs. Lawson did, and I set myself to learn several of the Bible stories by heart. By the end of the year, I could understand most of what was said to me, and I could make myself understood. And my repertoire of stories, which I tried to tell the muleteers each night, was growing. At the end of that year Mrs. Lawson became seriously ill, her body simply worn out. There was no doctor within miles, so I had to nurse her to the best of my ability. Near the end she said, "God called you out of my side, Gladys, in answer to my prayers. He wants you to carry on my work here. He will provide. He will bless and protect you." She died soon after that, and I was left alone, the only European in that part of China. But at least God had allowed Mrs. Lawson to live long enough for me to be able to carry on her work. I kept the inn going, and we held services regularly in the mission hall. I visited houses and gave what medical aid I could to those in need, and I went out into the villages with Mr. Liu to preach in marketplaces. But I soon found that the inn did not bring in enough to pay Mr. Liu, the cook, and keep me in food. We only needed a few pounds a year, but now that Mrs. Lawson's small private income had ceased, the standard rate we were allowed to charge for a night's lodging was not enough. Also, I was very lonely and my position was no easy one. I was only a young woman, and every night my inn was crowded with rough, peasant muleteers. Certainly I could speak their language now. In fact, it was the only kind of Chinese I could speak, for I had learned most of it when listening to them each night. I prayed anxiously, but the way seemed beset with difficulties. I wondered if God was telling me I had to move on from Yancheng, though where I could go I had no idea. 5 Among the feet one morning the old cook said, "You ought to go and bow to the Mandarin." "But why should I bow to the Mandarin?" I demanded. "The Mandarin is a very important person. He can order your head to be cut off." I certainly did not relish the prospect, so I asked, "But how do I bow, and what do I say?" The cook could not tell me, as he had never bowed to the Mandarin himself, but he suggested that he would go out and ask some of the townspeople what to do. A long time later he came back. "I have asked many people," he said. "They cannot tell you what to do because you are a foreigner, but they all say you must put on your best clothes." I looked down at the old things I was wearing. "Then that settles it," I replied thankfully. "I cannot put on my best clothes because these are all I have got." So there the matter seemed to end, but I felt uneasy because the Mandarin was all-powerful in the province. He was a kind of local ruler or magistrate, responsible for law and order in all the villages of the district. It was just 3 days after my conversation with the cook that there was a great commotion outside my gateway, and I went out to find the Mandarin himself entering my courtyard. He was dressed in beautiful clothes, with a wonderful headdress on his head. But what alarmed most was the great, long, curved sword at his side. And behind him were 3 soldiers also with long, curved swords. My cook's warning about heads coming off made me approach my visitor very apprehensively. Then began the formal bowing and salutations and expressions of sympathy over the loss of my companion, but finally the Mandarin came to the reason for his visit. "Miss Aylward, I have come for your help." "My help?" I repeated foolishly. "Yes, I have come about your feet." "Not my head?" "Of course not. It is because you have big feet." I looked down in astonishment. After all, I only took a size 3. "I do not understand, Mandarin." "I have received a letter from the government, from the new government, and I am much troubled by it. It informs me that by government decree the ancient custom of the binding of women's feet must cease throughout China." "That is a good thing," I replied. The poor women are crippled by it. The government is holding me personally responsible for stamping out this ancient custom in this part of the province of Shanxi. Oh, I see. Ah, but you do not see. The government makes the decrees, but how can I enforce them? A man cannot inspect women's feet, a woman must do it. And in all this district there is no woman with unbound feet except you. But what can I do, Mandarin? Will you become the inspector of feet? It will mean traveling all over this part of Shanxi. The government will provide a mule and 2 soldiers to accompany you. The salary, however, is very low, only 1 measure of millet a day and a farthing to buy vegetables. I could hardly believe my ears. Was this God's plan for me? Was this how He was providing for my simple needs? I will do as you wish, Mandarin, but you understand that I have come to China to tell your people about the God I worship. If I inspect the women's feet, I shall use the opportunity to preach in all the lonely villages. I understand and I acquiesce. A man's gods are his own affair. I have no religious bias. Also, from the standpoint of this government decree, your teaching is good, because if a woman becomes a Christian she no longer binds her feet. Then I gladly accept your offer. The Mandarin made his farewell, and with much bowing he departed. I went into my room and fell on my knees in humble worship and thanksgiving. The way was clear. My place was here. God's plan for me life was unfolding before me. Yan Cheng remained my center and, between them, Mr. Liu and the cook carried on the work of thine, for sometimes I was away for a week or more at a time. My 2 soldiers and I would set out in the morning with our mule, which was carrying a good supply of dried food, and travel all over that mountainous province. When we came to a village, the soldiers went on ahead and summoned everyone to the village clearing. Then they repeated the Mandarin's instructions, announcing that foot binding was now illegal and a punishable offense. The men would shuffle and look uncomfortable. They liked their women to have little feet, it was a sign of beauty and had always been done. Then the soldiers would shout, "If any child's feet are bound, her father will be taken to prison." GLADYS is the government foot inspector. She must see the feet of every woman and child. Any woman who refuses to have her feet examined will be punished. GLADYS was the Chinese name I had been given. It meant, virtuous woman. Then I would start to talk to the people. I would tell them a story, very often a fairy story like Little Red Riding Hood. I would get them all laughing and happy and teach them to sing a chorus after I had explained the meaning of the words. Then I would talk to them about their feet. You know that boys' feet and girls' feet are all alike. If God had wanted girls to have little, stunted feet He would have made them like that. But instead He made them all the same. And now the government says the feet of girl babies must be allowed to grow naturally. They must not be bound. Any women who bend their babies' feet will be punished. If you men let your daughters' feet be bound, the soldiers will take you away. It was too late to do anything to help the older women, but something could be done for girls in their teens. I made them unbind their feet, and ordered them to wear shoes that were big enough for them. They hated the idea at first and thought that it would ruin their chances of getting a husband. But the soldiers told them, "You can either unbind or go to prison. Please yourself, little sister, it is very comfortable in prison." Sometimes in the evenings the villagers would come to the inn where I was lodging for the night and ask me to tell them more stories and teach them more courses. So for months and then years I traveled around to village after village until I became known and welcomed and made many friends. I was called the storyteller, and the villagers never tired of hearing the Old Testament stories told over and over again. As I look back, I am amazed at the way God opened up the opportunities for service. I had longed to go to China, but never in my wildest dreams had I imagined that God would overrule in such a way that I would be given entrance into every village home, have authority to banish a cruel, horrible custom, have a government protection, and be paid to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ as I inspected feet. Gradually there were ones and twos converted here and there, and in each village a little group gathered, the beginning of a small church. So through the next years, as the gospel was preached, the practice of foot binding ceased, opium taking was reduced, and a witness to the saving grace of Jesus Christ was set up in many places. I now lived exactly like a Chinese woman. I wore Chinese clothes, ate their food, spoke their dialect, and even found myself beginning to think as they did. This was my country now, these northern Chinese were my people. I decided that I would apply to become a naturalized Chinese subject. In 1936 my application was granted and my official name was AI-WEH-DEH. 6 Nina though I had made friends among the Chinese, I still longed for fellowship with someone of my own kind. I had prayed for years that someone would come out from England to share my work, but no one came, so I went on alone. The dreams I had long ago of a husband and children of my own were fading. It looked as if the Lord intended me to walk alone all my days, but sometimes the isolation of my position weighed heavily upon me. One day I was feeling utterly depressed, and had prayed almost in desperation that God would send someone to help me. I had been out to the villages and was on my way to make my report to the Mandarin who, through the years, had become a firm friend. I noticed a woman with a child sitting by the roadside. The sun beat down mercilessly upon the child's bare head, and she looked desperately ill. She was thin, horribly dirty, and covered with sores. "That child shouldn't lie out in the sun like that," I said, looking down at the miserable little body. "She is my child. It is no business of yours what I do with her." "Woman," I said sternly, "it is my business. I am my widow. If you do not attend to that child, she will die." "Well, if she does, I can get another to take her place tomorrow, or maybe the day after." I stared from the woman to the child in horror. Stories I had heard of children being bought and sold must have been true. A woman such as this revolting creature could buy a child and then let it go without any sort of punishment. As I stood gazing at the child, my eyes filled with tears. The woman leered at me and said in a whining voice, "You can have her if you like for half a crown." "No," I said, though I could scarcely speak. 2 shillings. Then, she wheedled. "I haven't got 2 shillings," I replied angrily. "And you should be ashamed of yourself. You know very well that another couple of hours in the sun and that child will be dead." I turned and went on my way to the Mandarin's house. I was too angry and upset to give him my report, but instead I poured out a tirade against conditions that allowed traffic in helpless infants. "You and I can do nothing," the Mandarin said calmly. "Such things must be stamped out by new government laws just as foot binding has been dealt with." When I returned home, the woman still sat there. "A shilling, lady," she said as I came near. "You can have her for only a shilling." Again I looked at the thin, miserable, unwanted scrap of humanity, and my heart ached for her sufferings. I put my hand into my pocket and found that all I possessed was 5 Chinese coins, about the equivalent of 9 pence in English money. I held them out. "This is all the money I have." The woman grabbed the coins, picked up the child and pushed her in my arms. "She is yours, lady. I knew you had a kind heart." So 9 pence came into my life and helped to fill the aching void. Here was someone I could love and care for, someone whose eyes lit up when I approached. I washed her and fed her, and within a few days she was a different child and was making the place seem like a home. A few months later 9 pence brought in a little boy from the streets. He, in turn, brought in 2 more, and so on. Before long I had about 20 children dependent on me, and often there was very little to feed them on. But we never actually went without, and, at least, I could not complain of being lonely. Indeed, often I craved for a few moments of peace. About 35 cent, about 28 cent, about 14 cent 7 Mrs. Chingoni Day. As I traveled, the road was especially rough and stony, for it led straight across the mountains. The mules were laden with provisions and bedding, and I was sitting right on top of the pack on the leader off the mule train. I was hot, tired and dirty, and would have liked a bath and a comfortable bed, for we had traveled a long way since leaving home. But just ahead lay a village with a bad reputation, so I had more important things than baths to worry about. The 2 soldiers who had been appointed to act as my bodyguards walked stolidly along beside the mules. They scarcely spoke, but I believe they were secretly proud to be in charge of this strange foreign woman. They had found that although I was small they had to do as I told them. They had also found that I always told them the truth, and that I treated them kindly. In time, my soldiers and I became quite fond of each other. As we entered Juanson, Luster village, no one was in sight, until a muleteer shouted, and out ran the innkeeper. We were taken into a filthy, dark room, smelling horribly of animals. The innkeeper looked at me askance when told that I was Iwede and why I had come. "I will see the women tonight," I said. "Wait until tomorrow," the innkeeper suggested. "If I do, word will get around the village, and the women will have time to hide the little girls." "We will begin at once," I replied firmly. So my 2 soldiers and I started out, the innkeeper muttering curses after us. I told my soldiers to hurry, for I felt sure that the innkeeper was already sending messengers around the village. We saw several women and inspected the children and ordered that there must be no more rebound feet. Then we came to a house where there was no glimmer of light. I felt that here there was going to be a struggle. I knocked and called. There was absolute silence. Then one of my soldiers banged on the door, shouting, "Open up, this is Iwede who has been sent by the Mandarin." Still silence. "Call and tell them that I am coming in through the window if the door is not opened," I ordered. The door opened a crack and a tiny, frightened face peered round it. Immediately I pushed the door wide and stepped inside. "Now, woman," I said boldly, "I know what you are hiding, because the God I worship has told me all about it. So bring those little girls out at once, or I will search and find them myself." The woman scuttled away and returned with a poor, thin, terrified little creature about 4 years old. She could not stand, for her little feet were in the process of being bound and her eyes were full of tears. She crouched pitifully on the floor. I picked up the child, the tears now streaming down my face at the sight of her misery. "Is all well?" shouted the soldiers at the door. All is well," I replied, and sat on the brick bed, with the child on my knee, and quickly unbound her tiny, hot, aching feet. "Fetch some warm water in a bowl," I ordered. "Oh, that is good," the child murmured. Her tears turned to smiles as I massaged and bathed her feet. I started singing quietly, and the child relaxed sleepily in my arms. Suddenly she started up. "What about Precious Pearl, and Jade Lily, and Glorious Ruby and Crystal?" "They will come too," I said gently, and put her down. "Bring the other children," I ordered the woman, who had stood staring at me all this time. "There are no other children," she declared. "That child talks stupidly." Going to the door, I called to my soldiers, "There are other little girls, but this woman will not bring them out." "There are no more children," she shouted. "Then we will search," the soldiers said firmly. "Very well, I will bring them," the woman said sulkily, and brought out 4 others. I unbound all their tiny feet and bathed each one, singing to them and loving them. At first they were cowed and terrified, but gradually their fear disappeared, and before long all 5 little girls were peacefully asleep. Feeling that I dared not leave these children, for I did not trust the woman who had charge of them, I told the soldiers to fetch our belongings from the inn. They made themselves as comfortable as possible in the outer room while I shared a kang with the 5 children and the frightened, grumpy woman. A little lamp containing peanut oil was left burning, so the room was not in complete darkness. In the middle of the night I awakened to see the woman sitting up, weeping bitterly. Creeping over to her, I asked her what was the matter. "I am frightened of my master," she sobbed. "He will kill me when he returns." "I will deal with him," I said boldly. "I have been sent by the government, and my 2 soldiers will see that he does you no harm." "You cannot understand," she moaned. "He is wicked and cruel. He bought me, and now he has bought these children. As soon as their feet are ready, he will sell them to whoever will pay the most money for them." "I know someone who will take all your fear away," I replied. "Jesus Christ has sent me to help you. I will tell you about him, and he will comfort you." Lying beside this poor, frightened, lonely woman, who had been bought like a mule and was now kept like a slave, I told her the story of God's great love for poor creatures like herself, of Jesus who loved her and died for her, and I told her how happy she could be. This wonderful news seemed too good to be true. Never had she heard anything like this before. How much she longed for this Jesus to help her and to save her from the terrible beating her master would give her when he heard that she had let GLADY A into the house. For 2 more days I went from house to house with my soldiers, returning each night to the home of the 5 little girls, where Mrs. Ching was living in dread of the moment when her master would return. In the 3rd morning, I roused them all as soon as it was light. "I am going to take you all to live with me in the city in my mule inn where I have other little boys and girls," I told Tiger Lily, Precious Pearl, Jade Lily, Glorious Ruby and Crystal. "You will learn to read and to sing and to love Tian Fu, your heavenly Father, who sent me to look for you." "What about Mrs. Ching?" they asked. They did not love this woman, for she had been cruel and unkind to them, but they knew what would happen if she were left behind. "Mrs. Ching will go with us too," I replied. The children rushed around excitedly on their unbound feet, full of happy expectation. Already they looked very different from the cowed, grubby, Little wives I had first seen. My two soldiers seemed quite glad to take such a large crowd under their protection, and all of us, with the exception of Mrs. Ching, set off gladly for home. She, poor woman, believed she was being to Kento prison. To her the city was an awful place. There would be no one to speak for her. Her master would follow her because he had paid money for her, and he would either leave her in prison or drag her back to a village and beat her continually. On reaching the city, it seemed as if hundreds of children rushed out to greet us. Actually there were only 24, but they jumped and shouted and knocked each other over in their efforts to be the first to reach me. The old man who acted as cook looked calmly on. He was just as glad to see us as the children, but he was too old to shout and run. Bao, Precious Bundle, the youngest, somehow reached me first, and I took him up in my arms. He was as delighted to see my dear children as they were to see me. Gradually they quieted down, and politely, one by one, I introduced the newcomers. Then I handed live-odd little girls over to a big sister, who took them away to be washed and fed and put to bed. Mrs. Ching watched all this in silence. Now she came nearer and said, "When are you going to send him to prison?" "Prison?" I exclaimed. "I am not going to send you to prison. This is going to be your home. You will have to sleep with me, I am afraid, as the inn will be full tonight." Mrs. Ching stared in amazement. "You mean you want me to live here with you? You know how mean and cruel I was to those little girls. I refused your God, I was rude to you, yet you still want me?" "Yes, I want you because my God wants you," I replied. Mrs. Ching turned away and stumbled into the kitchen, where Chang, the old man, was stirring a huge bowl. I followed and stood near the door, wondering how Chang would treat this newcomer. "You can stir this," he said without looking up. "I want to make a little pot of nice thick porridge for me, dear one." "Your dear one? An old man like you is a dear one?" Mrs. Ching exclaimed.